The next stitch I'm going to demonstrate is an understitch. So an understitch is sort of a type of edge stitch. So if you watch the demonstration on an edge stitch, it happens really close to an edge, usually a folded edge or sometimes a seam. And in this case, for an understitch, this is going to be really, really close to my seam line. So the thing that we typically use understitches for is to keep a garment facing or lining toward the inside of that garment. So if you've ever created a garment and had a neckline or an armscye where a little bit of that facing or the slick lining that you happen to use is kind of coming up over the fashion edge and you don't want to see that, then this understitch is going to keep that in place and keep it from rolling to the outside of the garment. It'll keep everything nice and tucked in. This also is a great stitch because you don't have to see the machine stitching from the outside. This will happen toward the inside of the garment. And so it's not as if I would do what I did with a top stitch and stitch through all the layers. You certainly could do this to the outside or edge of a garment and keep everything crisp and in place, but then you have a top stitching to be seen. So if you don't want to see that, then you can do an understitch instead. So for the demonstration purpose, I've labeled my little piece of fabric here, lining versus fashion. So whatever line I just sewed, I'm going to press out that line, which I just did. Then the next step is to actually push all your seam allowance toward the lining edge. So I did open it completely so that my seam is nice and flat and open, but now I'm going to push that seam allowance back to one side, and specifically you need it to be the lining side. So this keeps the seam allowances away from the fashion part of the fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and iron this in place. So I've just gone back over that line. So all my seam allowances now are pushed into the garment so they will stay neat and tucked away. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it on the right side of the garment so that I'm not really looking at the seam allowances, but I know that I've pushed them to the proper side. Now we're going to do an edge stitch for this understitch. So the difference between the edge stitch and the understitch is that this is a branch of the edge stitch and the understitch is specifically to keep this lining or facing out of the way. Now I'm using, like I did on the edge stitch, the inner edge of my presser foot. So I'm using the inner edge of the right side of my presser foot here to line up that seam so that my needle will fall just to the left, just to the lining side of the fabric, and it's going to go through the lining as well as the lining seam allowance and the fashion seam allowance that I have pushed over. I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. And I'm keeping an eye on this seam so that it hits just the inner edge of my presser foot there. And I'm stitching very, very close to my seam, but definitely past the seam. Okay. If you examine that closely, you can see that it's just past the seam. And go ahead and turn off my machine so that the camera stops vibrating. And you can see that a little better here. You can see that my stitching is just to the left of my seam. Now for the final step, and this again won't be seen on the fashion side, for my final step, I'm going to go ahead and press this flat as if this were the armscye or the neckline or a piece of the garment that I wanted that lining to stay back. So now from the fashion side, I've got this lovely crisp edge, and my lining will no longer sort of roll or bubble over that edge. It will stay down to the back side, and that's because of this nifty little line of edge stitching.